A teacher humiliates a poor student, but she doesn't know that his father is.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Daniel Moore stood in front of the gates of Riverside Academy High School, an overwhelming feeling sweeping through his mind. This grand and magnificent school was unlike any he had ever known. The luxurious architecture of the buildings, the expansive campus adorned with neatly trimmed trees like a royal garden, everything here felt alien. Riverside Academy was a gathering place for the wealthy, where the children of corporate moguls, politicians, and successful entrepreneurs were educated to become the next generation of the elite. Looking around, Daniel felt his differences becoming increasingly apparent. He was a poor student from a working-class family, granted a special scholarship through a program supporting financially disadvantaged but exceptional students. This made him feel completely out of place among his peers, who had grown up believing they inherently deserved their wealth and status. From the very first day of class, he noticed the divide. The other students wore pristine uniforms, crisp white shirts, and polished leather shoes. In contrast, Daniel wore a faded, old shirt and slightly worn-out sneakers. While his classmates chatted about international vacations and expensive possessions, Daniel quietly sat alone, his eyes focused on his books, trying to ignore the disdainful glances cast in his direction. What made things even harder was his homeroom teacher, Mrs. Anderson. From their very first encounter, Daniel could sense the coldness in her gaze. While she always smiled warmly and showed care toward the wealthy students, offering constant praise like, "Great job, Emily," or, "Well done, Jonathan," for Daniel, there was only distance. She looked him up and down, her sharp eyes clearly showing disdain. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. "I heard you got a scholarship." "How incredible." Though her words seemed complimentary, the way she emphasized each one made Daniel feel like an unwelcome intruder. Emily Thompson, a privileged student and the daughter of a famous tycoon, sat near Daniel in class. From the moment he entered, Emily had been casting scornful glances his way. "Does anyone else smell something?" "It smells cheap," she whispered to her friend beside her, not bothering to hide the disgust in her voice. The class erupted in laughter, and Mrs. Anderson didn't even bother to intervene. The first few days at Riverside Academy were truly a nightmare for Daniel. Despite his efforts to ignore the murmurs behind his back, he couldn't escape the sense of isolation. The peak of the discrimination came during a lesson on the American Dream. Standing in front of the board, Mrs. Anderson, in a smug tone, introduced what she considered the most important topic for her students' dreams of success and wealth. "The American Dream," she said, "is freedom and opportunity for everyone, so that anyone, if they work hard, can achieve success." Her words seemed positive, but Daniel sensed something off in her delivery. As other students took turns sharing their dreams and ambitions mostly centered on inheriting family companies or vast wealth, Daniel mustered the courage to raise his hand and speak. He stood up, his eyes filled with determination, and began to share his perspective. "The American dream isn't just about becoming wealthy or owning material possessions," he said. "It's also about equal opportunities for everyone, regardless of their background or social status. But in reality, not everyone gets the same chance." Before he could finish, Mrs. Anderson interrupted. "Daniel," she said coldly, "I don't think someone with your background has the qualifications to fully understand the value of the American dream. People who don't live in this world can't truly comprehend what we've gone through to achieve success." The classroom fell silent. Daniel felt as though someone had slapped him in the face. Her words were not just a personal insult but a complete dismissal of the values he believed in. Emily, not missing an opportunity, turned to her friend and sneered. "See? I told you, not everyone understands the American dream. Especially not someone like him." Daniel remained silent, saying nothing further. He sat down, his head lowered, staring at the book on his desk, though his mind was spinning in a whirlwind of anger and humiliation. On the outside, he tried to stay calm, but inside, he felt his heart breaking. Jonathan Parker, one of the most prominent and wealthy students in the class, sat nearby and added to the tense situation. "Daniel," Jonathan spoke up after Mrs. Anderson had humiliated him. "If you really want to succeed in this country, maybe you should learn how to make money first. At Riverside Academy, the American dream is about wealth, not those lofty ideals you're talking about." Mrs. Anderson smiled approvingly, as if everything was going according to her plan. "Exactly, Jonathan. Very insightful. Here, we don't just talk about ideals, we actually live and practice the American dream every day." Daniel sat there, his heart full of anguish. He knew the world wasn't fair, but facing it daily, especially from those in positions of power like his teacher, was a profound pain he struggled to put into words. At the end of the class, Mrs. Anderson approached Daniel's desk. "I think you should reconsider speaking up in class," she said. "Not everyone can grasp the vision of people like us. And clearly, you still have a lot to learn." The teacher's words were another blow to Daniel's spirit. He wanted to push back, to say that the American dream belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy, but he knew that saying anything at this moment would only make things worse. He lowered his head and nodded slightly, swallowing the hurt deep inside. Daniel told himself that he wouldn't let the sharp words of his teacher and classmates wound him. But the harsh reality of Riverside Academy made it difficult for him to hold his ground. Each day, the discrimination from Mrs. Anderson and wealthy students like Emily Thompson and Jonathan Parker added another scratch to his heart. One morning, during a lesson on American history, Mrs. Anderson suddenly shifted the discussion to personal and family achievements. She asked each student to share the greatest success their family had achieved. Emily Thompson stood up, her voice dripping with arrogance, recounting her parents' billion-dollar company and their luxurious trips around the world. "I've been everywhere," Emily said, her eyes darting toward Daniel in a challenging manner. "Obviously, not everyone has such opportunities, especially those from less fortunate backgrounds." The class burst into laughter, and Mrs. Anderson made no attempt to stop it. Instead, she nodded as if in agreement with Emily's words. Daniel felt his face flush with anger. He wasn't someone who lost his temper easily, but the constant belittlement had pushed him to his limit. Still, he tried to suppress it. He knew that reacting would only make things worse. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stood up, trying to stay calm, and spoke sincerely. "My family doesn't have much, but my parents have worked hard their entire lives to give me a better future. That's the greatest achievement I could ever be proud of." Mrs. Anderson smirked, clearly dissatisfied with Daniel's answer. "We're talking about notable achievements," she said, emphasizing each word. "I'm not sure you fully understand the meaning of the word achievement, do you?" Daniel was stunned by the mocking question. In front of the entire class, his homeroom teacher, the person who was supposed to inspire him, was belittling his family simply because they weren't wealthy. But before he could respond, Jonathan Parker chimed in with a sneer. "Maybe the greatest achievement in his life is getting into Riverside Academy on a scholarship. Not bad, considering where he comes from." The class erupted in laughter again, and this time, the laughter felt like knives cutting into Daniel's heart. Mrs. Anderson stood there, making no effort to stop or reprimand Jonathan. Instead, she looked at Daniel with a pitying expression. "Perhaps Jonathan is right," she said. "Getting into this school is already a big opportunity for you, Daniel. But I advise you to focus on your studies rather than things you don't fully understand. Success in this society requires more than just effort." Daniel clenched his fists, his heart filled with frustration. He knew that success wasn't solely about money but also about relentless effort and determination. But at Riverside Academy, these qualities seemed to hold no value against wealth and power. The following days only deepened Daniel's resentment. Mrs. Anderson constantly found ways to undermine him during lessons. Whenever he spoke, she interrupted or made sarcastic remarks. When he scored high on tests, she would comment mockingly. "Maybe you have more free time than the others since you don't have to worry about inheriting a family business." In another class, when students were assigned to present on economic issues, Daniel spent a significant amount of time researching and preparing an excellent presentation on social inequality. As he stood confidently in front of the class, sharing his insights, Mrs. Anderson couldn't stand seeing him shine in front of his peers. "Daniel," she interrupted. "Are you sure you fully understand this topic? Based on your personal experience, do you really have enough knowledge to evaluate economic inequality?" This time, Daniel couldn't remain silent. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice firm but respectful. "I think I understand inequality very well. I live with it every day." Mrs. Anderson raised her eyebrows, seemingly offended by Daniel's defiance. "Be careful with your words, Daniel. Don't think that just because you have a few personal opinions, you can argue with someone who has decades of teaching experience." Daniel bowed his head, unwilling to prolong the argument in front of the class, but he knew his self-esteem had been attacked publicly. At the back of the room, another student, Thomas, chimed in with a light but cutting tone. "Daniel, maybe you should wait a bit before speaking up. We're here to learn about success, not to hear complaints about inequality." Mrs. Anderson nodded. "Exactly, Thomas. We can all learn from success and overcoming challenges, not from criticizing society." The belittling and discriminatory words of his homeroom teacher, along with the approval of his classmates, left Daniel feeling more isolated than ever. He felt like the only person in the class who didn't belong. Riverside Academy, the prestigious school he once thought would provide the best opportunities for his future, now felt like a prison where he was judged not for his abilities but for his background. One day, after class ended, Daniel slowly packed his books, not wanting to face the disdainful looks from his classmates. Emily Thompson approached him, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "You know, Daniel," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You really don't belong here. It would be better if you reconsidered staying at Riverside Academy. We don't need people like you here." Daniel clenched his hands tightly, wanting to respond, but he knew it would be futile. He walked out of the classroom, feeling weighed down by the discrimination and contempt he faced daily. But deep inside, he resolved not to let them bring him down. He had endured hardship in his life, and he wouldn't let Riverside Academy, no matter how prestigious, break him. After enduring the scorn at Riverside Academy for days, Daniel thought things couldn't get worse. But he was wrong. The upcoming parent-teacher meeting would be another challenge, a stage where Mrs. Anderson had meticulously planned to publicly humiliate him in front of the wealthy parents. She wanted to prove that Daniel didn't belong in this environment, that he was merely a mistake of the scholarship program. That day, Daniel walked into class with a heavy heart. The parent-teacher meeting was scheduled for late in the afternoon, and Mrs. Anderson had made no effort to hide her enthusiasm when mentioning it. She seemed to have meticulously prepared everything to humiliate him. Standing in front of the class with a sharp gaze, Mrs. Anderson announced, "This afternoon, we'll have a very important parent-teacher meeting. All parents will be present to discuss the academic achievements and attitudes of each student in this class." Her eyes lingered on Daniel just a bit longer than necessary, increasing the unease he felt. Emily Thompson and Jonathan Parker, sitting nearby, didn't miss the opportunity to flash malicious smiles. Jonathan whispered, "This is going to be fun. I can't wait to see how Mrs. Anderson presents Daniel." The class snickered, and Daniel tried to keep the tension from overwhelming his thoughts. He knew this meeting would not be just a regular discussion but rather a public attack on his dignity. By late afternoon, parents began arriving, their luxury cars filling up the school's parking lot. Well-dressed men and women entered the hall with confident smiles, clearly unbothered by anything that might happen. Daniel walked beside his mother, Mrs. Maria, a modest and humble woman with kind but anxious eyes. Mrs. Anderson was already standing at the podium, smiling as all the parents took their seats. She began the meeting with a confident tone, introducing each student and discussing their accomplishments. When she spoke about Emily Thompson and Jonathan Parker, she spared no effort in praising them, lauding their intelligence and talents while highlighting their family's successes. Emily is an outstanding student, not just academically but also in terms of her sense of responsibility. I'm confident she will carry on and expand her family's business successfully, Mrs. Anderson said, her gaze lingering on Emily with pride. Jonathan's turn was no different. Jonathan, you are the pride of the Parker family. He is destined to lead this class in the future, not only because of his intellect but also because of his visionary outlook. When it was Daniel's turn, Mrs. Anderson's tone shifted dramatically. She stood tall, her piercing eyes fixed on Daniel and his mother. And then, we have Daniel Moore, she began, her tone heavy as if preparing to deliver an indictment. Daniel, a student from a disadvantaged background, was admitted here through a scholarship designed to support those without financial means. Mrs. Maria, sitting beside Daniel, visibly tensed as she listened to Mrs. Anderson's words. She gripped Daniel's hand tightly, as if trying to pass on her strength to him. Mrs. Anderson continued. While Daniel has made efforts, I must say that integrating into the Riverside Academy environment appears to be a challenge too great for him. Riverside Academy is a school that demands excellence not only in academics but also in attitude and conduct. Unfortunately, Daniel does not seem to meet the standards we strive to maintain. The wealthy parents began murmuring, some casting sympathetic glances toward Daniel, while others appeared indifferent. Mrs. Anderson scanned the room, as if seeking their agreement with her statement. Emily Thompson, seated with her parents at the front, took the chance to whisper to her mother. I told you so. He doesn't belong here. Mrs. Anderson, clearly enjoying the moment, continued without hesitation. Daniel may be a diligent student, but as I mentioned, Riverside Academy isn't just about effort. We need students who stand out, who can represent the future of leadership. Unfortunately, Daniel doesn't have the necessary background to compete with students who come from more advantageous circumstances. Daniel clenched his fists under the table, struggling to keep himself from losing control. Mrs. Anderson's words felt like daggers aimed directly at his sense of self-worth. He knew it wasn't because he lacked ability, but because she had never wanted him to succeed. Every word she spoke was meant to humiliate him in front of the people she revered, the wealthy and powerful. Jonathan Parker leaned toward his father and whispered. See? I told you he doesn't fit in at Riverside Academy. I said it from the beginning. Mrs. Anderson paused, scanning the room with a look of confidence before continuing. We need to reconsider the idea of extending opportunities to students from different backgrounds. Not everyone can meet the high standards of Riverside Academy. A prestigious school like this must protect its reputation. Mrs. Maria sat in silence, her face pale from the hurtful words. She knew her son was being treated unfairly, but she didn't know what to do. Daniel felt as though the entire world was against him, but he was determined not to let Mrs. Anderson's words break his spirit. He knew he had to be strong and overcome these challenges. But Mrs. Anderson wasn't finished. She escalated the situation further by looking directly into Mrs. Maria's eyes and saying, I sincerely advise that students like Daniel consider seeking educational environments more suited to their circumstances. Riverside Academy is not a place for everyone. A stifling silence fell over the room. The parents, though silent, clearly understood the implication of her words. Daniel felt as if thousands of eyes were focused on him, the humiliation swallowing him whole. The meeting continued, and the tension in the room only grew heavier with each of Mrs. Anderson's words. She stood firmly at the podium, her voice steady but cold, as if every sentence had been carefully crafted to attack Daniel. Daniel, she went on, is a prime example of how scholarships do not always yield the desired outcomes. While we understand the importance of creating opportunities for disadvantaged students, it does not mean we should lower our school's standards to accommodate those who lack the capacity to truly excel. Her gaze swept across the parents, and Daniel could see many of them nodding in agreement, or at least showing no sign of disagreement. This made him feel more isolated than ever. His mother, sitting beside him, lightly trembled. She tried to maintain her composure, but Daniel knew how deeply hurt she was. Mrs. Anderson showed no intention of stopping. She continued to publicly undermine Daniel, criticizing his academic abilities and efforts. While Daniel may achieve decent scores on tests, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. That is not enough to compensate for his lack of integration and social skills. Riverside Academy is not just about academic knowledge, we teach students how to communicate, collaborate, and, most importantly, adapt to an elite community. And I'm sorry to say that Daniel does not seem capable of achieving that. Daniel bit his lip, trying not to let his anger explode. But each word from Mrs. Anderson was like a sharp blade piercing his pride. He felt as though he had been turned into a laughingstock in front of the wealthy, people who would never understand the hardships he had endured just to sit in this room. Jonathan Parker, sitting with his parents in the front row, couldn't suppress his laughter at Mrs. Anderson's criticism. "I told you," Jonathan whispered to his father, his tone full of satisfaction. "Daniel never belonged here." Jonathan's father, Mr. Parker, a wealthy and prominent businessman in the city, nodded in agreement. Riverside Academy is for students with a future, for those who can truly make something of themselves, he said quietly, his voice laced with disdain. After tearing down Daniel's dignity enough, Mrs. Anderson decided to conclude with what she considered a kind piece of advice. "I believe that, given his circumstances, Daniel should consider seeking a school that is more suitable for him, a place where he can fully develop his abilities without the pressure of a demanding environment like Riverside Academy." The parents in the room began nodding in agreement, and some even murmured to each other about how Daniel didn't belong. All eyes turned toward him, filled with pity, as if he were merely an inadequate boy unworthy of the opportunity he had been given. Daniel felt as though the entire world was against him. Emily Thompson, still wearing her smug smile, turned to her mother and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Daniel should understand that excellence isn't something you can buy. Sometimes, money isn't enough to achieve success, and that's something he just doesn't get." Emily's mother, Mrs. Thompson, shrugged indifferently and replied, "Perhaps. But it's clear he doesn't belong at Riverside Academy. This place is only for those with a clear future ahead." Daniel felt a surge of anger and humiliation rise within him, but he stayed silent. He was used to the mocking and the criticism. However, being publicly shamed in front of his mother and the other parents was a wound he knew would not heal easily. Mrs. Maria, a single mother who had worked tirelessly to raise Daniel, had remained silent throughout the meeting. But now, she could no longer endure it. Even though she knew her voice carried little weight in a room full of powerful people, she stood up to defend her son. "Excuse me," Mrs. Maria said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "My son has worked so hard to earn his place here. Daniel doesn't have the same advantages as the other students, but I believe he deserves this opportunity. Not everyone is born with everything handed to them, and people like Daniel have to work 10 times harder to achieve what you all take for granted." Mrs. Anderson looked at Mrs. Maria with thinly veiled disdain but maintained her fake polite tone. "We understand that, Mrs. Maria. However, Riverside Academy is a place for those with the potential to lead. We cannot lower our standards just because a student comes from a different background." Daniel felt as if he had been slapped. His mother had to stand up and defend him in front of everyone, but he knew that Mrs. Anderson had no intention of changing her views. This room, filled with the wealthy and powerful, didn't care about his struggles. They only cared about preserving the status and reputation of their own children. Thomas, another student, didn't miss the opportunity to add fuel to the fire. "Daniel," he said loudly, "you should understand that Riverside Academy is for the elite. It's not a place to help losers." Daniel turned to look at Thomas, his eyes blazing with anger, but he remained silent. He knew that any reaction now would only make him look worse. Yet inside, a storm of resentment was brewing. At that moment, the doors to the meeting room swung open. The school principal, Mr. Martinez, walked in with a stern demeanor, immediately silencing the room. Mr. Martinez rarely attended parent-teacher meetings like this, and his unexpected arrival made it clear that something significant was happening. Mrs. Anderson, noticing his entrance, appeared momentarily flustered but maintained her arrogant tone. "Mr. Martinez, we were just discussing the case of Daniel Moore. I've explained clearly that he isn't a good fit for Riverside Academy." Mr. Martinez cut her off firmly. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. "And there's a truth I believe everyone here needs to understand right now." The room fell completely silent. Mr. Martinez approached the table, his gaze briefly meeting Daniel's before turning to address the parents and Mrs. Anderson. "Daniel Moore is an exceptional student, not just because of his academic abilities, but for a reason that many of you may not yet know." Mrs. Thompson, sitting beside Emily, frowned, unable to hide her curiosity. "Principal, what are you talking about?" she asked. Mr. Martinez didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at each person in the room. "I think it's time everyone here knows that Daniel's father, Mr. Moore, is not who you think he is." The room seemed frozen, with all eyes turning toward Mr. Martinez, waiting for his next words. Daniel felt his heart race. He had never known there was anything special about his father that needed to be revealed. Mr. Martinez continued, his tone now grave. "Mr. Moore is one of the largest anonymous benefactors of Riverside Academy School." His words landed like a bomb in the room, leaving everyone stunned. Mr. Parker nearly choked on his coffee, hastily setting his cup down on the table, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mrs. Thompson, who had always been so haughty and dismissive of Daniel, sat with her mouth agape, unable to process what she had just heard. Mrs. Anderson was completely taken aback, but she tried to maintain her composure. "Principal, are you certain? Mr. Moore, he's a major benefactor. Why have I never heard of this?" Mr. Martinez nodded, his voice calm but weighty. "That's correct. Mr. Moore has contributed significantly to Riverside Academy, but he insisted on keeping his identity confidential. He wanted to support students from disadvantaged backgrounds, having experienced similar struggles himself." The room was engulfed in absolute silence. Daniel, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never known that his father, whom he had always thought was just an ordinary worker, had been quietly supporting Riverside Academy all these years. "Mrs. Anderson, I believe you have forgotten what is most important at Riverside Academy," Mr. Martinez said. "This is a school that not only teaches academics but also instills the true values of life. Hard work, resilience, and the ability to overcome challenges are the principles we hold in high regard." Mr. Parker, who had been openly critical of Daniel earlier, now awkwardly tried to join the conversation. "Principal, we don't deny Daniel's efforts, but our children also need a stable environment, one without too many differences in background." Mr. Martinez raised an eyebrow, his sharp gaze fixed on Mr. Parker. "Differences in background? What do you mean, Mr. Parker? Riverside Academy is not a school exclusively for the wealthy. It is a school for those with potential, regardless of their background or financial circumstances." Daniel sat there, feeling a wave of emotion rise within him. His father was not only someone who had supported him but also someone who had quietly helped many other students like him. Most importantly, Daniel now understood that he was not alone in this fight. Mrs. Anderson, now at a loss for words, sat in silence. Her face shifted from cold confidence to embarrassment. The truth revealed by Mr. Martinez had completely unraveled her plans, leaving her unable to further tarnish Daniel's dignity. The atmosphere in the room was heavier than ever. Mr. Martinez's revelation left the room in stunned silence. Parents sat frozen, unable to meet his or Daniel's gaze. Mr. Parker quietly placed a hand on his son Jonathan's knee, glancing awkwardly at Daniel with a discomfort that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Anderson, who had always exuded confidence and authority, now appeared paralyzed. She couldn't hide her discomfort, her face turning red. She swallowed hard before speaking, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Martinez. I didn't know Mr. Moore played such an important role at Riverside Academy. Mr. Martinez frowned slightly, looking directly at Mrs. Anderson. You didn't know because Mr. Moore chose to keep his contributions anonymous. He didn't want his donations to become a weapon to manipulate or control anyone at this school. Mrs. Thompson, who had made cruel remarks about Daniel earlier, now struggled to hide her shame. She glanced at her husband, trying to mask the unease in her voice. We didn't mean to. We didn't know the truth about Mr. Moore. If we had known earlier, we would have. Mr. Moore stepped into the room, interrupting Mrs. Thompson. That's right, you didn't know, he said, his voice calm but commanding. But the important thing is, you didn't need to know. What you needed to know was that Daniel has worked hard and deserves to be here not because of me, but because of his own efforts. Mr. Moore's gaze swept across the room, landing on each person from Mrs. Anderson to Mr. Parker and Mrs. Thompson. Everyone avoided his eyes as if guilty, as though every harsh word they had spoken earlier now felt like a dagger turning back on their own conscience. Emily Thompson, who had been silent for most of the meeting, now shook her head slightly, trying to maintain a composed appearance. Still, it was clear her arrogance had evaporated. I think Daniel might have misunderstood me, Emily said softly, as though trying to retract her earlier mockery. We only wanted the best for the class. Daniel didn't say anything, but his gaze locked on Emily, silencing her completely. In his eyes, the quiet of the room was the clearest proof of his victory. Principal Martinez turned to look at Mrs. Anderson, his eyes filled with disappointment. I had hoped that, as a homeroom teacher, you would understand the true value of education. Riverside Academy is a place for students to grow holistically, regardless of their background or family circumstances. I cannot accept the way you have discriminated against a student simply because he doesn't come from a wealthy family. Mrs. Anderson opened her mouth as if to speak but couldn't form any words. She simply bowed her head, fumbling with her hands under the table. The arrogance she had always displayed was completely shattered. The tension in the room remained thick. Mrs. Anderson kept her head down, avoiding everyone's gaze. The room seemed to be waiting for her response, but she remained completely silent. Mrs. Thompson tried to break the oppressive silence, but her voice was filled with awkwardness. Principal Martinez, we didn't intend to create discrimination. I believe all of us want what's best for Riverside Academy. Principal Martinez looked at Mrs. Thompson with a stern expression. What's best for Riverside Academy, he emphasized each word, is ensuring that every student is treated fairly and given an equal opportunity to thrive. We cannot allow students like Daniel to be treated unjustly simply because their backgrounds differ from others. Mr. Parker, sitting next to Jonathan, lowered his head in embarrassment. He had always been confident that he understood education and power, but now, with the truth about Mr. Moore revealed, he realized he had been wrong. He turned to his son, shaking his head slightly, as though warning Jonathan to cease any further actions that would belittle Daniel in the future. Perhaps we've been too harsh, Mr. Parker admitted in a low voice, loud enough for others to hear. Jonathan said nothing, but his face was filled with shame. He had never imagined that the father Daniel had occasionally mentioned was the school's largest benefactor. He felt small and foolish for spending so much time mocking and belittling his classmate. At this moment, Daniel slowly stood up, his gaze sweeping across the room. I don't need anyone's pity, he said, his voice steady but firm. I only want a chance, like everyone else. I know I'm not as wealthy as others here, but that doesn't mean I don't deserve to be here. Mr. Martinez nodded, his eyes glimmering with pride. Daniel is right, he said to the room. We cannot judge a student by their background or family wealth. Education is not a privilege for the wealthy, it is an opportunity for everyone. And Daniel, you have proven that you absolutely deserve to be here. Mrs. Anderson could only lower her head, unable to say another word. She knew that everything she had done to belittle Daniel had been completely overturned, and there was no way to regain control. The humiliation on her face was evident, not just because she had misjudged Daniel but because her arrogance had been publicly exposed. Principal Martinez stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. I hope that after today, we all remember that the true value of a student lies not in their wealth or lineage but in their spirit and effort. The meeting ended, but the lessons of the day would remain etched in everyone's minds. Daniel and his mother walked out, their hearts filled with relief and pride. He knew that from now on, no one could deny his true worth. In the days following the tense parent-teacher meeting, a wave of change swept through Riverside Academy. Principal Martinez's words and the revelation about Mr. Moore opened the eyes of many. The underlying discrimination among students wasn't just perpetuated by classmates but also by those entrusted to guide and lead them, people like Mrs. Anderson. This could no longer be tolerated in a prestigious school like Riverside Academy. A few days later, an official announcement from the school was sent to all parents and students, stating that Mrs. Anderson had been suspended and would no longer serve as a homeroom teacher at Riverside Academy. The decision came directly from the school administration after thoroughly reviewing what had transpired during the parent-teacher meeting and evidence of her discriminatory treatment of Daniel and other disadvantaged students. That morning, the atmosphere at the school was noticeably different. Students whispered about the administration's decision, and the absence of Mrs. Anderson became the main topic of conversation. Emily Thompson, who had once been a staunch supporter of the teacher, now sat quietly in a corner of the classroom, saying nothing. Her previous arrogance and smugness had disappeared. Jonathan Parker also no longer exuded confidence. Instead, he appeared remorseful whenever he glanced at Daniel. That afternoon, Principal Martinez convened a special meeting with all the students. Standing at the podium in the auditorium, his eyes stern yet filled with concern, he prepared to deliver a profound lesson about the role of educators in shaping a just and inclusive educational environment. My dear students, he began, his voice warm yet powerful. A school is not merely a place for you to learn knowledge from books. It is also a place for you to learn how to live, how to be good people, and, most importantly, how to respect one another. A teacher is not just someone who imparts knowledge but also someone who guides, nurtures, and creates opportunities for you to become the best versions of yourselves. He paused, looking around the auditorium, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the students from the wealthy ones like Emily and Jonathan to those from disadvantaged backgrounds like Daniel. Mrs. Anderson failed in her role. Instead of helping you become strong, united, and capable of growth, she chose to discriminate and judge students based on their background and financial status. That is not what Riverside Academy stands for. Daniel sat silently, listening to every word Principal Martinez spoke. He felt a shift not only in the environment around him but also within himself. He had once felt small and disrespected, but now, things were different. I want all of you to understand, Principal Martinez continued, that the role of a true teacher in education is not to judge students based on grades, wealth, or social status. A true teacher must help you recognize your true value, no matter where you come from. Emily, who had always been proud of her wealthy family, now lowered her head, unable to meet Principal Martinez's gaze. She realized that everything she had once valued, money, power, paled in comparison to the true worth of a person. A student raised his hand. It was Thomas, one of Jonathan's allies, in mocking Daniel. "Sir," Thomas said, his voice trembling with regret. "We were wrong to judge Daniel based on his circumstances. We hurt him. We will change." Principal Martinez smiled gently, his eyes shining with hope. Change begins with awareness. That is what truly matters. Learning to see others not by their appearances or backgrounds but by their efforts, character, and spirit. Jonathan, sitting next to Thomas, also stood up, his voice subdued. "Sir, I also want to apologize to Daniel. I didn't understand him and treated him unfairly." Daniel looked at Jonathan, his eyes softening. He stood up, walked over to Jonathan, and extended his hand. "We can all make mistakes, but what's important is that we learn from them," Daniel said sincerely. Jonathan grasped Daniel's hand, and in that moment, the entire auditorium fell silent. The positive change didn't come from one person alone but from everyone in the room. There was no more division, no more discrimination. Principal Martinez continued his speech, emphasizing the importance of creating a fair learning environment where every student had the chance to thrive, regardless of their background. "From today onward, I want all of you to evaluate and appreciate each other not by what you have but by what you've worked to achieve. Patience, determination, and solidarity are the values that will guide you toward success in the future." The lesson that Principal Martinez imparted was not just about fairness in education but also about the role of teachers in shaping the character and values of their students. A true teacher is not just someone who teaches theory but someone who inspires and encourages personal growth and mutual respect. Riverside Academy changed after that day not just because of Mrs. Anderson's departure but because all the students, parents, and teachers realized that education was not a competition of wealth or social status but a journey to discover and develop the true value of each individual. Daniel, once a student looked down upon, now stood as a symbol of resilience, and the transformation at Riverside Academy was proof of the power of fairness and determination. Education, Principal Martinez concluded, is the path that leads you to the future. And to walk that path, you must always remember, the value of a person does not lie in where they come from but in how they move forward. The story of Daniel Moore teaches us that true value lies in resilience, effort, and fairness, not in wealth or social status. Despite the discrimination from Mrs. Anderson, Emily, and Jonathan, Daniel's perseverance and integrity inspired a profound change at Riverside Academy. Principal Martinez's leadership highlighted the importance of equality and mutual respect in education. This story reminds us that success is built on character and determination, qualities that everyone can possess. It is a lesson that we all deserve opportunities to grow, regardless of our backgrounds.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.